So, already had the massive tech failures. I'm over that. Let's get started. So, I'm here today to talk to you about this incredibly long-winded title, the Using AAA 3D Engine Technology to Enhance 2D Pixel Style. Why did I write that? I don't know. But basically, I'm here to talk to you about our game, The Siege and the Sandfox, which is a 2D game that we made in Unreal Engine. And we're actually on their stand there today, and still, we're next to the biggest Unreal sign you've ever seen, and still more than 5 people have asked, so what engine are you using? So I'm here to kind of explain why we made that decision and why it's not as crazy as it might first appear, and things you should consider for your own games. So first, who the hell am I? That's a very good question. So I'm the design director at Cardboard Sword, the company making the game. Previously to this, I was a level designer in AAA games for about 8 years. The last thing I did was I worked on the Forza Horizon games, so Horizon 1, 2, and 3. That was fun, but I wanted to do something else. So I've been working independently since basically the start of the year. So what I want to cover in this talk basically is what was the decision-making process that led to a team that's experienced in AAA, mostly 3D games. Why did we make a retro 2D game that appears to leverage none of our experience? And as I said, why do we want to use what we're calling like a feature-heavy engine like Unreal? Why do we need that kind of functionality that at first you'd think we could use something like GameMaker, for example? And then I'll walk you through the sort of influences that led to our particular style that people compliment frequently, and then how we went from those influences to implement specific techniques that gives us a style where people think it looks like the old games, but really, if you look to them, it doesn't at all. And finally, I want to explain why we feel that you always want to use the best tools that are available, and I'll kind of explain as I go along what that really means and why I'm quite passionate about it. So just a little bit of context about Cardboard Sword itself. So the two founders, Ollie Bennett and Aidan Howe, met at Double 11 working on Little Big Planet Vita. If anyone played it, you're probably one of the 5 people that actually own a Vita, so congratulations. Now, Aidan met everyone else at Frontier Developments. I feel like nearly everyone has either worked at Frontier or knows someone that works at Frontier. There's at least 2 people here. So it's one of those sort of places where lots of people meet. And then basically I worked on a project at Frontier called The Outsider for about 3 years, and it was cancelled. So I thought it was probably time to do something else, and I moved on to Playground Games, as I said, worked on some racing games for a while, which was fun. And then we all assembled basically the end of 2015. So who cares, right? Why is that important? I don't say that just to show off, because it's not that impressive really, but it sort of shows that we have all this traditional AAA experience. It's going to be different to someone who's a fresh independent who's just come out of university. We've got a lifetime's worth of experience of what actually works for AAA development, and sadly several lifetimes experience of what doesn't. So that sort of frames how we think about things and how important tools are to us. So we got started. What's our first project going to be? It's always tempting to stick to what you know, but this is going to be our one opportunity to do whatever the hell we liked. So, it's pretty scary, but we all agreed we should do something new. None of us had ever made a 2D game before. The artists themselves are 3D artists traditionally, so we were like, yeah, well, let's go to something with absolutely no experience and see what happens. It'll be fun. We naively thought, well, you know what? It's probably going to be a bit faster than 3D. There's less stages in the pipeline. It's that infamous phrase, how hard can it be? Turns out very, but just remember that I said that we assumed it would be easier. And finally, animation. None of us are animators by trade. We've got great respect for the craft, but none of us can do it. None of us wanted to do it, and we certainly couldn't dedicate anyone to it full time. So that was something we wanted to avoid, and in 2D, you don't need to do any of that. So I'm just going to walk you through a few games that were the key influences for The Siege and the Sandfox. Now, this first game, I'd actually never heard of this game before the artist brought it to my attention. It's Batman on the NES. And there's a few things I want to show you here that the artists always point out to me. Firstly, if you look at Batman himself, he's 4 shades. So they're achieving so much with just such a limited color palette. And the main thing to us was actually, if you see the little building behind him there, how it's going from fully lit to fully shadow in about 2 or 3 colors. They're implying that detail in that shadow. They obviously couldn't physically make that detail, but your eyes, your mind's filling in the blanks there. And taking that to the extreme, see how confident these artists are that nearly a quarter of that screen is completely black. There's nothing there at all. But, if you're an artist that's got the strong conviction that that's going to work, it looks good. And another game that does that a lot is one that hopefully most people are familiar with, Zelda. So again, here, if you look at this, if you look at the grass and you look at the water there, it's literally one color. And why is that important? Well, if you imagine that if you see the tiles in the middle there where you've got all the bridge there, if there's that much sort of noise and detail all over the scene, it's quite tiring. It's nice for your eye to have somewhere to rest. And that's something we really wanted to bring across. And you can't talk about pixel games without talking about Metal Slug, obviously. Obviously, we're not going to make a game that looks as good as Metal Slug, but we want to aim high, right? We aspire to have the quality that they have. They didn't cut any corners. They had a huge dedicated team, which we don't have. But the thing is, they took no shortcuts, and that's why that game looks so good. That's the primary reason. They were talented artists that were working within those limitations they had. And another thing that definitely came across is, for anyone that's played it, the charming little bounce animations for the characters are lovely, and that's something that you'll see in our game. So we needed a springboard for our overall style. We had an idea of sort of the influences of classic pixel games, but what we didn't have was any concept art. At this stage in the project, we were literally zero budget. So using a technique I like to refer to as stealing, we borrowed some concept art from Ubisoft. And this is from the Prince of Persia games. So this first shot here was a huge influence of basically a lot of props and the overall color scheme. Particularly, if you go and play the game, you'll see our door frames and the ladders, and there's a tiny little portcullis down there at the bottom. That's a word I've never heard of before working on this. So that was one of our big influences. And secondly, giant palaces. We wanted big palaces. So this was obviously just great to look at for general sort of architecture, as well as a lot of key things that to start with, we basically copied all of the pillars, the walkways, the fences, the banners, little details like that. And obviously, general architectural style is quite similar. But actually, probably most importantly was this one. We wanted to have big underground caves, and we wanted them to connect to our other tile sets. So this one just is a great shot to show the interaction between standard sort of buildings and hard rock surfaces. Like, I love that stairway, the way it's just carved into the rock, and the way it meets the sort of top walkway there. So once we'd done that, we sort of nailed down some influences, and we were happy about the general art style we wanted to go for. It was time to actually try and make it for real. So we started in Photoshop. This is the first ever technical shot of the game. It was a couple of months' work. I want to stress that the artists had never done 2D pixel art before, ever. Unfortunately, they're disgustingly talented, so it didn't really take them too long to pick it up. So also, if you remember earlier, I said about the Metal Slug influenced animations. I'm sure you can see the heavy influence there of the little cheeky bounce there. Same with this guard as well. And you can also see in the top left, we've got the color palettes there. We were trying to keep those sort of similarly limited. So as I said, the guides had never done this before, but there's loads of brilliant tutorials, particularly Derek Yu has done a great series of tutorials. If you Google it, you'll find it. Took these guys from nothing to great quality in a couple of months. So we had our Photoshop image. We're pretty confident we can do it. Let's make it in a game engine. So we started with Game Maker purely because it was free and initially it seemed like a good fit. So to start with, these are some of the test environments we made. You can see there's no real level design to them at all. It's just, let's go through the workflow. Let's see if we can make the tile sets. Let's see if we've got everything we need to make all the different sort of shapes and sizes we need. And once we've worked out all the pieces, let's just see how we feel about Game Maker as a product, as a series of pipelines. But also you can see we're starting to sort of lean on our influences already. Like if you remember that shot of Batman that was nearly quarter black, this here is very similar. And I think it looks really nice. It's framing the character there. And again, the detail is implied rather than actually there. And obviously these days we're perfectly capable of actually creating that detail with unique textures, unique tile sets, but it's an artistic choice rather than just a limitation. So during our time of making this, as I say, it took a couple of months. It was just time to evaluate what was out there. So the landscape had really changed. There were more, as we're terming these sort of feature-heavy engines were available now. Things like Unreal, things like the Unity license had changed, Lumberyard, etc. They were all out there and much more affordable than they were before. So we had a little think about what we were doing and where we were going. In conclusion for us, GameMaker didn't really let us leverage any of our existing AAA experience. Things like you don't get access to the source code, there's not too many integrated pipelines, there's lots of external tools you tend to have to use. There's nothing wrong with GameMaker, obviously many fantastic games have been made in it, but it wasn't allowing us to use what we already knew to sort of push ahead. For us personally, spoilers, Unreal Engine 4 was the best. So why was it the best for us personally? The artists were very familiar with Unreal. One of them had worked professionally with Unreal Engine before on a couple of epic titles. I spent loads of time messing around with their editor and their pipelines, so there's a degree of familiar. We were quite familiar with it, particularly the lighting and material system, which is obviously something we're leaning on heavily. And something we were really keen on trying is, they have a system called Blueprint, which is their visual scripting. Lots of other engines also have visual scripting, but this is they're very dedicated to it. You can use it for pretty much everything. Even our coders use it a lot of the time as well. So we were keen to use this. Obviously, there's only 5 of us, so efficiency is key. If the artist can throw something together and the code don't have to touch it, that's really useful to us. So we were hoping that would work out for us. Also, we've got ambitions beyond this project, obviously. We're really enjoying it. We're having a great time doing 2D stuff. But, in the future, we'd like to do something else, probably more traditional AAA stuff. If we use GameMaker or some of these other things, it's likely really we're going to have to throw away a lot of what we've got. Instead with this, sort of high-level systems like dynamic music systems, some of the AI systems, I can drag them straight over. So thinking beyond the first project was something, again, which has been instilled into us from AAA, is something we thought we'd like to bring along. So did it work? And ironically, I really hope this works because I'm not running it the way I tested it. Ooh. Fingers crossed. Close. Ooh, it went close. Awesome. The joy of running things not the way you test them. Okay, so yes, basically, we think it did work. That's what we made in 2 months in Unreal Engine. We used the assets that we got from GameMaker, the tile sets we'd already made, and just ported them over. We thought the timing worked out nicely. We'd go out to GDC and just see what kind of reaction we get, see if it was worth continuing and what sort of interest we could drum up. We actually got a really great response, much better than we expected. A lot of publishers were interested, but in particular, we got a lot of interest from Epic. I personally have spent a long time scheming some huge sort of 6-month plus campaign. I was going to have to chase after them, follow them home, etc., until they noticed us. But you know what? That was actually all kind of a waste of time because within 2 days, we'd had both founders of the company come over and play the game. The one that's particularly satisfying to me is Tim Sweeney on the right there. We've got a very grumpy resident Swedish coder, and I showed him the first photo. I was like, we've got Mark Rain to come and play the game. And he's like, nah, but you won't get Tim Sweeney to come and play it. And then I sent him that photo and went, yeah, we did. So, it's always fun. And again, I don't show this don't put this up just to show off. I'm not going to lie, I'm proud of it. It went really well. But it's part of what you should think of when you're picking an engine. You're not just picking what's literally in front of you. You're also picking a partner, right? You're picking someone you're going to be working with. What can they do for you? Is it something they're going to be interested in? Is there a way they can support you? And obviously for us, we met them out there. We had a long chat. That's led to us receiving a development grant from them. That's led to us being on the expo floor, courtesy of them. So you need to think about that from day one, really. So what did we find in this 2-month period? So the majority of Epic stuff for 2D is done with this thing called Paper 2D, which is their 2D plugin, which handles all the sprites and the tile sets and the tile maps, etc. We pretty quickly found out, to be kind, it's not production ready. Basically, it was sort of an in-house pet project by a couple of the guys that we actually met out there. And unfortunately, obviously, it's quite hard for them to dedicate the resources when people are much more interested in things like Paragon, etc. We kind of expected this, so we've had to dive in and sort of do code support. And when I say code support, I mean like proper, full-blooded, let's go into the source code C++ stuff. So we've been able to do it, but it's a hurdle you probably wouldn't have in other engines you might consider using for 2D. However, outside of these limitations, this pipeline really worked for us. The artist's already super familiar with the general setup of materials and textures, all of that stuff, so they could just get cranking straight away. And likewise, I was quite familiar with their general level system and their world building and generally their pipeline, so I was able to understand what they were doing, work with them. And as well, the coders, Blueprint is very straightforward for them to look at. So it was a common tongue we could share, and that worked immediately really well. And speaking of things that worked really well, the lighting really did just work. We just turned it on, and it looked really cool. Now, it's quite subtle in this shot, so this is like the game maker version of it. Admittedly, in this shot, the lighting's quite subtle, but I hope between this and the video earlier, you can see that it's adding quite a lot of depth without sort of tarnishing the sort of classic pixel style. In this shot, really, sort of, you just got a bit of post-process and some other sort of lighting, but it just adds a general depth to everything, and it works really nicely together with the sort of the areas of darkness there, again, harkening back to the Batman Nez thing. So that worked really well. And then it would be very tempting to just be like, okay, well, let's use everything. Let's use depth of field. Let's use all the other crazy effects that are just there because this works so well. Then it was time for us to sort of step back and think about what makes this a pixel art game? What can we not do? And so I decided to say, well, it's a kind of authenticity thing. We want the game to feel authentic. It's a lovely phrase, but what do I actually mean when I say that? Well, if you think of games like Super Metroid or Castlevania, things like that, if you haven't played them recently and you're thinking about it, the pixel art's still great, but probably a lot of the surrounding details probably aren't as good as you remember. So what we're actually trying to do is kind of evoke that memory of the classic in your minds rather than just create literally what was there. So, if I wanted to be slightly more pretentious about it, and I do, you want to take the modern effects, but you don't want to compromise those classic aesthetics. So again, lovely, but how do we actually implement that? So there were two stages, really. What I did is, we look at these classic games, and you go, what literally could they not do? What were the limitations of their engine? What were the limitations of what pixels can do? And let's stick to as many of those as we can. And also, let's look at some of the features where, you know what, if they'd had access to this power, what do we think they might have done if they'd had it? So I'll just run through a few things here. So these are the classic limitations. These are really easy to describe, but actually sticking to them becomes more and more difficult. If you ever see games that look a little bit ropey that are pixel art, I guarantee they've broken some or all of these rules because it's very tempting. It makes your life much easier. So pixels can't skew, they can't rotate, they can't be scaled, they can't be stopped, and they are always one-to-one resolution. So they're not square, they are square, they're not rectangular, they're not weird shapes, which is obviously, it's super easy to do, but it just ruins it. Likewise, we're being really restrained in our use of transparency and gradients. Today, we're not limited at all. We can do whatever we want there, but they couldn't, so we're going to respect that. We're going to use more than they did, but we're not going to go mental because you're ruining it. The same with the color palette. As you saw those ones earlier, we're using a small set. With those classic games like Batman Nez, it would have probably been about 4 shades per color. We're using more than that, but we're not using anywhere near the sort of full range that's available to us. And finally, no motion tweening. I think the best example of this is if you're familiar with Mark of the Ninja, that's sort of a flash style of animation, and the central character, the ninja, is just kind of this amorphous blob where the limbs just pop out at just the right points to grab the walls. It looks fantastic for their game, but it's not something pixels can do, and it just wouldn't suit our game, which unfortunately makes your life so much harder. So this is what the artists would colourfully tell me, don't mess with the pixels. We had a few golden rules. You should pretty much always be able to count them. In sort of AAA terms, it's a low resolution game. You should literally be able to see where all the pixels are. This means you stop using things like sort of mass distortion of the screen, any blurring, depth of field, stuff like that. You're instantly compromising like the biggest asset you've got if you do that. So yes, likewise, maintaining that ratio. So there's a few little modern enhancements we have here, and I'm just going to give a very basic overview. Unfortunately, I imagine on a projector this one isn't super clear, but yeah, it's not really, but trust me, there's a mist there, and it looks amazing. So this one's pretty simple. For a modern engine is the important thing. So we've just got a post-process volume over it, which is applying some sort of different colors. And then on top of that, we've just got a panning texture of some clouds. So technically, we've already broken a lot of rules of what you could actually do during the time. But it's still pixel art. You can still count the pixels of all these clouds passing over. So we've bent the rules, not broken them, I feel there. Another one here, we're using color lookup tables to sort of help the player work out when they're visible, when they're not visible. So ironically, I hope you can see the one in the dark. It's probably slightly not visible enough. But so again, this is another one where technically this is technology that didn't exist. There's no way they could have done this. But you can still count the pixels. We're still using a limited shade. We're just using 2 sets of limited shades. So we feel like that's kind of acceptable. No one really bats an eye at that. And finally, just turn on some lovely little particles there. So again, all of this stuff couldn't be done. Now, the particles themselves are pretty much out-the-box Unreal particles, just disabled in depth. They don't do anything there. Completely impossible at the time, but because of the sort of size and shape of them, it doesn't stand out. What does stand out, and probably the time we bend the rules the most, is the distortion effect there behind the torch. I mean, yeah, we are just bending the rules there. Having distortion like that is not something that's possible, but we feel it's in quite a limited space, and we wanted to really make the torches look nice because it's a stealth game. You're either going to be in light or avoiding light. It's an object you're going to see a lot, so we thought there it was probably worth, just pushing the boat out a little bit. So just to wrap up on that section, we believe that we've made something that feels authentic. It feels like a game from that time, but it definitely isn't. We're using a lot of modern technology in ways that were not possible at the time, but we feel like we've set these rules and we've stuck to them. That's kind of the secret, right? Lots of people think there's a trick to it. A lot of it is purely just not breaking those rules. It's the thing that most pixel games do. And the artists probably weren't as surprised by this as I was, but just the basic lighting made a huge difference. Just the basic sprite material, just whacking some lights on it, huge amount of depth, everything just looked better overnight. We got everything we hoped for in terms of the visual scripting and blueprint and things like that. All of those effects you saw there, including the sort of gameplay coding implementation, the artists did all of it. We just let them do it. We didn't even have to ask. They just went out and did it. Code fixed a few of them because they caused some issues, but the point is they could get 90% of the way there rather than 0% of the way there, which has been my experience of basically any AAA studio. You've got your space and you can't touch anything else. So that was great. We were getting what we wanted. So we've got our tile sets, we've got our style, it's kind of working now. How do we turn all of that stuff into an actual game? So this all focuses around part of Paper 2D, the tile map editor, and that became our sort of universal tool that we're all sharing the space of. It lacked a few features that are very useful. The biggest one being not being able to resize the tile map once you've made it, particularly in the early days when we were just kind of guessing how big the level should be. If we realized later on it wasn't right, it was incredibly painful to fix it. And that's something that's very standard for most editors, but I point it out just so you know that it wasn't all smooth sailing. This is something you probably wouldn't encounter in a lot of other engines, so it wasn't all easy for us. So again, this is kind of fits to our tool set, right? Our rule set, rather. In classic pixel art games, probably the tile sets would have been, each tile, would have been like 16 by 16 pixels. So we make them bigger. We go for 32 by 32. They're still individual pixels. They still look chunky, but we can have more detail because we're not going to run into any memory limitations. Why not? No one ever questions it. No one's ever mentioned it, in a negative way at least. Now, again, with modern editors, even with time map editors, you don't have to place things on the grid. You do, though, because otherwise the artist would murder me. Again, it's a limitation that you actually work with rather than against, and if you ignore it completely, you're destroying part of the aesthetic of a pixel art game. So we always stuck to the grid, except when we wanted to put some more detail in. So we actually used a sort of half tile placement for that. And I can show you what that really means. So if you look at some of these props here, which I promised myself I'd learn the names of any of them. I don't know what any of those things are, but they're really lovely props, right? So at the moment, they're on the same 32 by 32 grid. It looks a bit rigid, like they're perfectly aligned with all of the pillars and everything. It doesn't look bad, but if you move them over a bit, again, it's not like dramatic. It's not like back of the box pictured there, but little touches like that actually add quite a lot over the course of the game. And it's something people probably won't actively notice, but it's all contributing towards that sort of classic aesthetic with some modern touches. So I alluded there to sort of all the different layers we have in our tile map. So I'll just run you through our sort of process for doing all this stuff. So this is what I get to look at all day. It's glorious, right? It's absolutely hideous, but that's really what I'm looking for as a designer. I don't get precious about anything I'm working on. If a bit of level doesn't work, I can just delete it. We started referring to these internally as ice palaces because of the sort of eye-melting color scheme, but it works for me. So I'll hand this over to the artists, and then they'll return something that looks nice. So this is the foreground layers here. There's 3 layers. Only one of them actually generates collision, and that's what the player's physically walking on. Everything else is just, a bit of eye candy on those detailed 16 by 16 grids. Likewise, unfortunately, probably not super visible. We've got 3 background layers doing the same thing. No interactive layers at all, just a nice sort of layer of detail in the background. And finally, sorry, super probably invisible. This is our sort of gameplay layer. We've got things like ladders and pillars, other things the players are likely to interact with, as well as some sort of final details that we want to highlight, particularly if you see top right, there's a bunch of moss and stuff on those steps. It's just, we might want to do something interesting with that later, so we separate it off, just so we've got access to it. And then finally, the tile maps for each sort of room, chuck them out separately, and then we can bring them into a standard Unreal level file. So we can add all the other entities that make up the game. Lighting, particles, animated sprites, post-process, gameplay entities, obviously the biggest of that being all the AI and things like that. And when you do that, this is what you get. So this is a nice little GIF that guys made a little while back, which sort of highlights the fact that it's a standard Unreal level file. It's still technically all 3D. Particularly, you can see all the lights still have volumes. We're still baking the lights. And if you squint, you might be able to see some other big blocky post-process volumes. But the point is it all just works. It's all tech that's designed for completely different purposes, but it pretty much all just worked. And so let's just sum up how we feel about that pipeline for us. So firstly, it's always nice to be wrong. We were completely wrong about how long this would take. This took easily as long as it would for me to do a 3D environment. A lot of this was down to just purely our inexperience of doing 2D environments, but also a lot of it is that, as I highlighted a few of them there, there's a few chinks in the sort of Unreal armor there, the stuff that they don't have in 2D that we just expected to work. Some of the effects, for example, on that torch I showed earlier, we wanted to use just a really basic refraction shader the guys had used for tons of 3D projects. It just doesn't work. They just go, oh, it should work. And you ask them, and they're like, oh, using the orthographic camera. No, it doesn't work. So we had to come up with a completely different solution, which obviously takes up a lot of time. But by and large, a tile map editor was very intuitive, as good as anything else we've used, and it was integral to their pipeline. It's not some weird external tool that you have to worry about conversion processes or weird inconsistencies. It just worked. You never thought about it. And something a bit boring and production-y, but super important, is there's only 5 of us, as I've said. We never really blocked each other because of the way it's all stacked together. One person works on one tile map, one person works on another. When they're in a level file, someone can layer all the lights, do all that, so we could all keep working all the time. If one of us is blocked, it's a fifth of the team just to sit twiddling their thumbs. So, as you've already noticed, we were wrong about quite a few things, which is always it's good to know. It was not easier, not at all, not even a little bit. It could have been easier had we broken some of those rules, had we been a bit sort of leaner on ourselves. And again, as I say, a lot of 2D pixel games, that's what they've done. Lots of them do lots of rotating and scaling and things like that. There's so many things you can do so quickly with that. But as soon as we set our sort of authentic perspective that we wanted, all those shortcuts disappear. So it just takes a long time. And also, it's a different type of art challenge. It's still approachable as an art challenge. But if you think of making 3D objects, the artists themselves often refer to themselves as 3D photocopiers. Like, if they're given a prop to make, within reason, if you know how to make props, you don't really have to know anything about it or care about it or really appreciate how it works. You just make it, you make the textures, you make the materials, throw it in the world, and then it's lit. It looks like the thing. When you're making a pixel game, obviously that's not true. You have to really appreciate sort of the light, how the light's going to fall on it, its shape, its form, and you have to imprint that on a really small number of pixels. Every pixel is super important. You could get hundreds of pixels wrong in different maps and material and stuff. It doesn't really matter with this. You get a handful wrong, it doesn't even look like the thing it's supposed to look like. So that meant lots of things had to be redone from scratch. And animation, okay, we didn't need anyone dedicated to it strictly, but it was incredibly time-consuming. And obviously, things that you can do with 3D stuff you can't do. If we decided we wanted to have a different, holding a different object or doing different things in the middle, you have to redo the whole thing. It's not reusable, it's not flexible. So we lost a lot of time there. However, Were we right to use a feature-heavy engine like Unreal Engine? I want to stress, obviously, there's lots of feature-heavy engines. Just Unreal was just the best fit for us. Well, unsurprisingly, yes, I think so. I think it was the best fit for us. It allowed us to leverage all of our AAA experience. It let us, get into the source code, work in a way we're used to working. We could all, people just can take on tech art roles. All the stuff's there, the material editors built in. All of that stuff that we knew how to do from AAA, we could just carry on doing. And this is the other really important thing, right? Unreal Engine, obviously, and all of these big engines, people literally write hundreds of books on stuff we didn't use and will probably never use in that engine. But that's actually great. Firstly, because the engine itself has to be robust enough to support all those features. So we don't have to worry about ever overloading it or really coming into any issues with our kind of game. And secondly, if we want to try something different, a bit from left field that isn't a typical effect, it's probably already there. I mean, for example, we experimented with normal maps, hated them, but it only took an afternoon to give them a spin. If we actually were using a lighter engine, that feature didn't exist, and we had to dedicate months to coding it, and then we still didn't like it, that's a huge amount of time we've wasted. So we just don't worry about that. And outside of art as well, same deal, like AI, loads of features there that are just there. It really worked. And we bet really heavily on the visual scripting, and it's really worked. Everyone has put code into this game. Everyone's kind of a gameplay programmer. It's just worked brilliantly for us. The artists make their levels, and if they want to make new features, we just let them. Obviously, later on, we'll probably tell them off. But for now, it's really useful because we get to try a lot of stuff super quickly. So just to kind of sum up how our experience has been going from AAA and to indie and how it's worked, I feel what's really important is that you find the tools that match your team. I mean, for us, for example, could we have found another engine that could have got us to that sort of first benchmark of 2D faster? Definitely. Like, there's loads of other engines. I don't need to mention them, you know them. But was there another engine out there that would allow us to leverage all this experience we've got and everything we knew about more advanced features? And once we reached that sort of top of the mountain, all these features we could do? No, I don't think so. I don't think there's anything else that would allow us to do that. So your team is going to be different, right? Your team's going to stay the same. You're going to make different kinds of games. Why would you just pick something that works just for that one game? Just pick something that's going to work for whatever you want to make in the future. And I think, you don't need to rule out using modern effects completely. Again, you see a lot of things in Game Maker or similar engines where they just go, it's classic pixel game, so we don't use any modern effects. I think, you're missing a trick there. You can use some of them. Some of them look great. Some of them are so subtle that people don't even really appreciate it's something that's not possible. So I wouldn't just throw them all out. And this is something I've sort of started to feel more passionate about as time has gone on. Something people very rarely consider, especially if they're just out of university or sort of fresh indies, is like quality of life and sort of improving your productivity and stuff like that. I've been through crunch. I've been through crunch several times. It's not a great way to work. And why that happens is because you have pipelines and systems that aren't really designed to sort of fit the kind of work you're doing. Stuff like this means that I've been able to achieve the goal that I wanted, that I work fewer hours every week than I ever did in AAA, but I'm so much more productive. I want it to be a job for life, so I'd rather not die of just like endless crunch. And again, if you start off on indie, you just probably think, no, it's fine, I can handle that. You can handle it 2, 3, maybe 4 times, but you'll look back and you'll probably regret it. If there's a way to do it without it, you should do it. And I think some of these big engines really let you do stuff like that. So in conclusion, sadly, this isn't a real button. We did look for it. It's not there. We are asked so frequently, I mean, it's basically how this talk began. What have you done to this game? Why does it look this way? Why does it look so good? And of course, I can say that it's not my work. It's not my art. Everyone's looking for this trick. And I would compare it to sort of like photographers. You go, oh, it's an amazing photo. What camera did you use? The camera's not really important. It's the person who owns the camera and knows how to operate all the functions and has specifically picked the ones they want to give the feeling or whatever they're looking. That's what's done it. So there isn't a trick. It's the result of hard work and strong art direction. I don't say that to be, I'm not trying to say, give up, it's too hard. The complete opposite. In the past, particularly again in AAA, a lot of these secrets, were locked away. You'd have to know a guy that knows a guy that wrote shaders full time. You don't need that anymore. You don't need that arcane knowledge. It's never been easier to do this stuff. To try at least, Unreal and other things are completely free. There's so much documentation out there. There's so many videos. There's so many live streams. Do it. Like, there's no reason not to. The fact that it's hard work shouldn't be discouraging. Anyone can work hard. So, unsurprisingly, I think you should. So thank you very much for listening to me waffle on about this game. I hope that's been useful to you. I hope you've sort of learned a few things and seen our approach. If there is time, I'm happy to answer a few questions. I will point out again, I'm not the artist, so if you ask anything technical, well, don't ask anything incredibly technical, email or tweet us, and I'll make sure someone responds. But in general, I can answer anything if you like. Thank you.